Picture this: a narcissist who has spent months, maybe years, feeding off someone's emotional energy suddenly finds themselves facing something they've never encountered before. The empath they've been manipulating, the same person who used to absorb their rage, validate their grandiosity, and clean up their emotional messes, looks them dead in the eye and delivers a response that makes their blood run cold. Not a threat. Not an insult. Not even an emotional reaction. Something far more terrifying to a narcissist's fragile ego: complete psychological clarity. The empath's voice is steady, their gaze unwavering, and their words carry the weight of someone who has finally seen through the elaborate theater of manipulation. They speak with the calm authority of someone who knows exactly who they're dealing with and has decided to stop playing the game entirely. What could an empath possibly do that would strike such profound fear into the heart of someone who thrives on control and manipulation? What transformation could occur within someone traditionally viewed as too sensitive or too giving that would fundamentally alter the power dynamics they've grown accustomed to exploiting? The answer lies in understanding one of the most fascinating psychological phenomena in human relationships: what happens when an empath reaches their absolute limit and chooses consciousness over conditioning, boundaries over boundless giving, and psychological sovereignty over emotional servitude. To comprehend the terror that awakened empaths inspire in narcissists, we must first examine this relationship through the revolutionary insights of Carl Jung. Jung understood that human psychology operates on multiple levels simultaneously. The conscious mind, the personal unconscious, and the collective unconscious all interact to create the complex tapestry of human behavior and relationship dynamics. Jung once observed, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." But what he didn't fully elaborate on was what happens when someone who possesses an extraordinary ability to understand others finally turns that penetrating insight into a tool of psychological self-defense rather than endless accommodation. The empath-narcissist relationship represents what Jung might have called a psychological compensation system: two individuals whose psychic structures seem to complement each other in ways that can be either healing or destructive, depending on the level of consciousness brought to the dynamic. Empaths possess what can only be described as the most sophisticated emotional and psychological radar system known to humanity. They instinctively read microexpressions, detect tonal variations that others miss entirely, and sense emotional undercurrents that remain invisible to most people. They build detailed psychological profiles of everyone in their environment, cataloging not just what people say and do, but what drives them, what fears govern their behavior, and what vulnerabilities lie hidden beneath their social masks. However, empaths have typically been conditioned, by family systems, religious teachings, cultural messaging, and often their own inherent nature, to use this extraordinary perceptual ability exclusively for healing, giving, and absorbing the emotional pain of others. They've been taught that their gift comes with an obligation to fix, rescue, and endlessly accommodate those around them, often at tremendous cost to their own psychological well-being. Jung's concept of the shadow provides crucial insight into what happens when an empath reaches their breaking point. The shadow isn't simply our dark side, it's our unlived potential, our suppressed power, our hidden capabilities that we've been taught to deny or repress. For empaths, the shadow often contains their capacity for psychological boundaries, strategic thinking, and what we might call conscious indifference, the ability to choose not to engage with someone else's emotional chaos. For years, even decades, empaths operate primarily from what Jung termed the persona, the social mask we wear to navigate the world. The empath's persona is typically characterized by endless patience, unconditional understanding, and an almost compulsive need to heal and harmonize. They present themselves as emotional sanctuaries, safe harbors where others can process their pain, dump their unresolved trauma, and receive validation without reciprocation. But every psyche seeks wholeness, and the persona is only one aspect of our complete psychological structure. When empaths begin to integrate their shadow, when they start to acknowledge and consciously engage with their capacity for boundaries, discernment, and strategic emotional withdrawal, they undergo a transformation that fundamentally alters every relationship in their lives. This integration process isn't dramatic in the way most people imagine. There's no explosive moment of revelation, no dramatic confrontation, no theatrical declaration of independence. Instead, something far more subtle and infinitely more powerful occurs. The empath becomes conscious of their own psychological processes and chooses to operate from awareness rather than automaticity. The awakened empath realizes that they have been unconsciously enabling destructive patterns by absorbing the consequences of other people's choices. They recognize that their compulsive helping has often prevented others from experiencing the natural results of their behavior, thereby inadvertently stunting everyone's psychological growth, including their own. To understand why narcissists are so profoundly threatened by awakened empaths, we must examine what Jung identified as the narcissist's essential psychological structure. Despite their grandiose exterior, narcissists are driven by what can only be described as an existential terror of being truly seen and known in their authentic state. The narcissistic personality is built around what Jung would call a false self, an elaborate psychological construction designed to hide what the narcissist perceives as their fundamentally flawed and unlovable true nature. This false self requires constant external validation, admiration, and what psychologists call narcissistic supply to maintain its precarious existence. Narcissists unconsciously seek out empaths for the same reason that vampires in folklore are drawn to certain types of victims. Empaths possess something the narcissist desperately needs but cannot generate internally: authentic emotional energy, genuine empathy, and the ability to see beyond surface presentations to the wounded person beneath. The relationship serves a crucial psychological function for the narcissist. The empath's natural tendency to understand, excuse, and accommodate provides the narcissist with a steady supply of validation while simultaneously offering them protection from the consequences of their behavior. When the narcissist acts selfishly, the empath finds ways to justify it. When the narcissist hurts people, the empath absorbs and processes that emotional damage. When the narcissist's mask slips, the empath pretends not to notice. This creates what Jung would recognize as a complex, a cluster of unconscious psychological energy that operates autonomously and compulsively. The narcissist becomes addicted to the empath's emotional energy while simultaneously resenting their dependence on it. They need the empath to maintain their false self, but they also unconsciously know that the empath sees through their carefully constructed facade. This psychological dependency creates a profound vulnerability. The narcissist knows, on some level, that their entire carefully constructed identity relies on the empath's continued willingness to play their assigned role in the narcissist's psychological drama. The awakening process for empaths involves what Jung called making the unconscious conscious. This means becoming aware of their own psychological patterns, understanding why they've been operating in certain ways, and, most importantly, recognizing that they have choices they never knew they possessed. The transformation typically begins with what I call the psychological breaking point, the moment when the empath's shadow finally says, "No more." This isn't about anger, though anger may be present. Anger is hot, temporary, and ultimately forgettable. This is about something much colder and far more permanent, a fundamental shift in consciousness that changes how the empath perceives themselves, their relationships, and their responsibilities. The awakening empath begins to engage in what Jung called active imagination, consciously exploring thoughts, feelings, and possibilities they've never allowed themselves to consider. For the first time, they might find themselves thinking, "What if I didn't have to fix this person? What if their emotional crisis isn't my emergency? What if I used everything I know about human psychology to protect myself rather than accommodate others?" This conscious engagement with previously suppressed aspects of their psyche creates a profound shift in how empaths show up in their relationships. They don't become cruel or vindictive, that would simply be another form of unconscious reactivity. Instead, they become strategically conscious about how, when, and with whom they share their emotional energy. The transformation manifests in several key areas. 1. Emotional boundaries. The awakened empath stops automatically absorbing other people's emotional states. They develop what we might call selective permeability. They can still feel and understand others deeply, but they choose whether or not to take on that emotional content as their own responsibility. 2. Response versus reaction. Rather than automatically responding to every emotional cue, crisis, or manipulation attempt, awakened empaths pause and consciously choose their response. They might recognize that someone is in emotional pain without feeling compelled to fix it. They might see through a manipulation attempt and simply not engage with it. 3. Information management. Empaths begin to practice what intelligence professionals call information security. They stop sharing personal details that could be weaponized against them later. They become strategic about what they reveal and to whom. 4. Energy investment. Perhaps most importantly, awakened empaths become conscious investors of their emotional energy rather than unconscious dispensers of it. They begin to ask themselves questions like, is this person capable of growth? Are they taking responsibility for their own healing? Is this relationship reciprocal, or am I simply being used as an emotional dumping ground? When empaths reach this level of psychological consciousness, their behavior becomes unpredictable to narcissists in ways that are deeply unsettling. Narcissists have built their entire interpersonal strategy around certain assumptions about how empaths will respond. When those assumptions prove false, the narcissist's sense of control and predictability crumbles. 1. The mirror of uncomfortable reality. Instead of reflecting back the narcissist's preferred self-image, awakened empaths begin reflecting back reality. When a narcissist makes a grandiose claim, instead of nodding along supportively, the empath might respond with calm, factual clarity, "That's not what happened. We both know what actually occurred." There's no emotion in the delivery, no judgment, no attempt to shame, just uncomfortable truth presented with psychological precision. This terrifies narcissists because their entire psychological structure depends on others participating in their preferred version of reality. When someone refuses to play along with their self-deception, it threatens the very foundation of their identity. 2. Strategic emotional withdrawal. This isn't the silent treatment, that's a manipulation tactic designed to punish and control. Strategic emotional withdrawal is something far more sophisticated and infinitely more unsettling. The awakened empath continues to interact in socially appropriate ways, but they remove all emotional investment from the relationship. They become professionally cordial, like a customer service representative dealing with a difficult client. They're polite, functional, and completely impersonal. The narcissist suddenly realizes they're no longer receiving the emotional supply they've become addicted to, and no amount of escalation or manipulation can restore that flow of energy. 3. Gray rock technique. While most people understand gray rock as simply becoming boring around toxic people, awakened empaths deploy it with surgical precision. They become selectively uninteresting, vibrant and engaging with healthy people while becoming a psychological void for the narcissist. The message this sends is devastatingly clear: you no longer have access to my authentic self. The version of me that you're interacting with is a carefully constructed facade designed to protect my real emotional world from your influence. 4. The implied exposure threat. Perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated weapon in the awakened empath's arsenal is what we might call the implied exposure threat. They don't threaten to reveal the narcissist's secrets or expose their hidden behaviors. Instead, they demonstrate, through subtle comments, knowing looks, or casual references, that they could expose them if they chose to. They might reference private conversations, allude to hidden behaviors, or make comments that prove how much they really know about the narcissist's psychological patterns. The threat is never explicit, it doesn't need to be. The narcissist understands perfectly well that this person possesses information that could destroy their carefully maintained public image. 5. Boundary setting without explanation. Awakened empaths learn to set boundaries without providing detailed justifications for their decisions. They say things like, "I'm not available for that," or "that doesn't work for me," without elaborating on their reasoning or providing emotional labor to make the other person feel better about their limits. This is particularly unsettling to narcissists because they're accustomed to being able to argue, negotiate, guilt, or manipulate their way around other people's boundaries. When faced with a boundary that's presented as a simple fact rather than an opening for negotiation, they find themselves in unfamiliar psychological territory. The most terrifying thing an empath can become, from a narcissist's perspective, isn't angry or vindictive, it's genuinely indifferent. Anger implies ongoing emotional investment. Indifference implies that the narcissist has become psychologically irrelevant. This indifference isn't cold or cruel, it's simply the natural result of someone who has stopped trying to manage outcomes they cannot control. The awakened empath recognizes that the narcissist's healing, growth, and happiness are not their responsibility. They understand that their previous attempts to rescue, fix, and accommodate have actually prevented the natural consequences that might motivate genuine change. Jung understood that true individuation, the process of becoming psychologically whole, requires us to take responsibility for our own psychological development while allowing others the dignity of their own journey, even if that journey includes learning through natural consequences and failures. When empaths embody this principle, they create what we might call a psychological vacuum around the narcissist. The emotional chaos, drama, and manipulation that used to draw immediate attention and intervention now meets with calm indifference. The narcissist finds themselves forced to confront their own behavior without a buffer, translator, or emotional shock absorber. When narcissists realize they're losing control over an empath, their behavior becomes predictably desperate. Jung would recognize this as the ego's frantic attempt to maintain its illusions when confronted with reality that threatens its continued existence. 1. Love-bombing renaissance. They'll attempt what appears to be a complete personality transformation, sudden gifts, grand romantic gestures, promises of change, declarations of love and appreciation. They might even engage in what seems like genuine self-reflection, acknowledging past mistakes and committing to different behavior. However, the awakened empath recognizes these behaviors for what they are, manipulation tactics designed to restore the previous dynamic rather than evidence of genuine psychological growth. They understand that real change happens gradually, consistently, and without fanfare, not through dramatic gestures designed to regain control. 2. Triangulation tactics. Narcissists will attempt to create drama by involving third parties, mutual friends, family members, or even complete strangers. They might try to make the empath jealous, concerned, or guilty by suggesting that others are providing what the empath is selfishly withholding. The awakened empath recognizes triangulation for what it is and refuses to compete for the narcissist's attention or to take responsibility for the narcissist's relationships with others. They understand that healthy relationships don't require constant drama and competition to maintain interest. 3. Emotional terrorism. In their most desperate moments, narcissists may resort to threats of self-harm, suicide ideation, or promises to destroy themselves if the empath doesn't return to their previous role as emotional caretaker. This tactic is particularly insidious because it exploits the empath's natural compassion and sense of responsibility. However, the awakened empath has learned to distinguish between genuine mental health crises and manipulative threats. They respond by providing resources for professional help rather than personal rescue. They understand that they are not qualified to prevent someone else's self-destructive choices and that attempting to do so often enables rather than helps. 4. Projection and character assassination. When other tactics fail, narcissists often resort to what Jung would call shadow projection. They accuse the empath of being narcissistic, manipulative, selfish, or cruel. They might launch campaigns to convince mutual acquaintances that the empath is the real problem in the relationship. This tactic is particularly effective against empaths who struggle with self-doubt and are prone to excessive self-examination. However, awakened empaths have developed enough self-awareness to recognize projection when they encounter it. They respond with the same calm energy they've cultivated in other interactions. If that's how you see me, you're free to remove yourself from my life. The transformation of a single empath creates ripples throughout their entire social ecosystem that extend far beyond their relationship with any individual narcissist. Jung believed in what he called the collective unconscious, the idea that individual psychological growth contributes to the psychological evolution of humanity as a whole. When empaths model healthy boundaries, conscious choice-making, and strategic emotional investment, they give permission for others to do the same. Other empaths in their social circle begin to question their own patterns of endless giving and self-sacrifice. They start to consider that perhaps their compassion might be more effective when applied consciously rather than compulsively. People who have been enabled in their dysfunction suddenly find themselves facing the natural consequences of their behavior when empaths stop absorbing those consequences for them. Some respond by finding new empaths to exploit, but others are motivated to finally address their own patterns and take responsibility for their psychological growth. Family systems that have been organized around the empath's role as emotional caretaker are forced to reorganize. Children who have watched their empath parents sacrifice themselves for everyone else's comfort learn that boundaries are not only acceptable but necessary for psychological health. Professional environments change when empaths stop automatically taking on extra emotional labor, cleaning up other people's mistakes, or accepting blame for team dysfunctions they didn't create. Colleagues are forced to develop their own emotional regulation skills rather than relying on the empath to manage the office's psychological climate. The process of shadow integration for empaths isn't about becoming cold, calculating, or indifferent to others' suffering. It's about developing what Jung would call conscious compassion. The ability to choose when, how, and with whom to share their empathic gifts. Awakened empaths don't lose their ability to feel deeply or connect authentically. Instead, they develop discernment about how to deploy their emotional resources most effectively. They learn to distinguish between people who are genuinely seeking growth and support versus those who are simply looking for someone to enable their avoidance of personal responsibility. This integration process often involves learning to tolerate what Jung called the tension of opposites. Empaths must hold space for both their natural compassion and their need for self-protection, their desire to help and their understanding that some help isn't actually helpful, their capacity for unconditional love and their recognition that some relationships require very clear conditions. The goal isn't to become someone different but to become more completely themselves. To access the full range of their psychological capabilities rather than operating from only one dimension of their personality. They retain their empathic gifts but deploy them strategically rather than compulsively. Empaths who successfully complete this integration process develop what we might call psychological sovereignty, the ability to remain centered in their own emotional reality while still being capable of deep connection with others. They become masters of what Jung might have termed psychological aikido, using others' energy and momentum rather than opposing it directly. When faced with manipulation, they don't fight against it or get drawn into emotional drama. Instead, they simply step aside and allow the manipulation to fall flat. When confronted with someone else's emotional crisis, they can offer genuine compassion without taking responsibility for solving problems they didn't create. Perhaps most importantly, they develop the wisdom to recognize which battles are worth fighting and which dynamics are worth engaging with. They understand that some people are committed to their own dysfunction and that trying to rescue them is not only futile but actually interferes with those individuals' opportunities for growth. These empaths become highly attractive to psychologically healthy people while becoming increasingly uninteresting to those seeking someone to exploit. They naturally begin to attract relationships based on mutual respect, reciprocity, and genuine compatibility rather than complementary dysfunction. Here lies the beautiful paradox that Jung would deeply appreciate. When empaths stop trying to heal narcissists, they create the only conditions in which genuine healing might actually become possible. By refusing to enable destructive patterns, they force accountability. By withdrawing emotional supply, they create space for authentic self-reflection. By declining to participate in psychological drama, they remove the audience that such performances require. The narcissists who are most terrified of awakened empaths are those who recognize, perhaps unconsciously, that the empath was the last barrier between them and their own psychological reality. As long as the empath was absorbing the consequences of their behavior and managing their emotional world, they could maintain their illusions of superiority and avoid the difficult work of genuine self-examination. Without that buffer, narcissists are forced to confront the wreckage of their own making. Some respond by finding new empaths to exploit, but they carry with them the memory of encountering someone they couldn't manipulate. Others, faced with consistent boundaries across multiple relationships, finally begin the difficult but necessary work of genuine psychological development. This is why some narcissists become obsessed with winning back awakened empaths. Not because they miss the person, but because they miss the psychological function that person served. They're not seeking reconciliation, they're seeking resumption of a dynamic that allowed them to avoid growth. The empaths who understand this distinction are those who can maintain their boundaries without guilt and move forward without looking back. If you recognize yourself in this description, understand that your awakening represents not a betrayal of your empathic nature but its evolution into its most powerful and effective form. True empathy includes empathy for yourself. Genuine compassion includes refusing to enable destruction, both others and your own. Jung taught us that the goal of psychological development isn't to become someone else but to become who we really are beneath all the conditioning, expectations, and social programming. For empaths, this often means discovering that they're much stronger, more perceptive, and more psychologically sophisticated than they ever imagined. The empaths who terrify narcissists aren't those who become cruel or vindictive. Cruelty is just another form of unconscious reactivity. They're those who become unavailable for manipulation, uninterested in managing other people's emotions, and unwilling to sacrifice their own psychological well-being for someone else's comfort. They don't seek revenge because revenge requires ongoing emotional investment in people who have proven themselves unworthy of such investment. They don't want to destroy anyone, they simply refuse to be destroyed. They're not interested in changing narcissists, they're interested in changing their own patterns of response. Your empathic gifts are meant to be shared consciously, strategically, and with people who can appreciate and reciprocate them, not depleted compulsively by those who view your sensitivity as weakness to be exploited. The narcissists in your life may indeed be terrified of this transformation, but their fear is not your responsibility to manage. Their comfort is not your job to maintain. Their growth is not your project to manage. Your job is to become whole, integrated, and authentically yourself, shadow and light, compassion and boundaries, healing gifts and protective instincts all working together in conscious harmony. That is true empathic power, and yes, it terrifies those who have been counting on your unconsciousness to maintain their illusions. The most profound act of compassion is sometimes refusing to participate in someone else's destruction, including your own. Thank you so much for staying with me through this exploration. If you found value in today's discussion, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share this video with someone who might benefit from it. And if you'd like to go a step further in supporting this work, you can now leave a super thanks below. It's a small way to say thank you, and it truly helps keep this channel going.